Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the show. Today, we turn our focus to one of Ethiopia's most enduring and complex ambitions, access to the sea. Past loss and future aspirations. More than 30 years after becoming landlocked, the question still stirs deep emotion and strategic debate. Why does it matter so profoundly? What sort of political and security dynamics can it shape? How Ethiopia can also pursue its legitimate interest while safeguarding regional interest in the Horn of Africa. To unpack this complex layer, I'm joined by distinguished scholar, political science and international relations, and also human rights lawyer, Professor 𝐼𝐈𝐻 ገብረማርያም. I'm your host, 𝐍𝐻. Do stay with us. Professor 𝐼𝐈𝐻, welcome to the show, and thank you for your time.
Thank you for inviting me to this dialogue.
Great. Let's start our discussion with a very simple issue, which is very trending. Ethiopia became landlocked before 30 years. Then today it becomes an issue and a trending issue as well. Is there any legitimate, subjective and objective ground that leads Ethiopia to be landlocked?
There is no legitimate reason for Ethiopia to be landlocked. I think it's a collusion of historical circumstances and perhaps the machinations of external powers that have brought this situation to our current reality. Ethiopia has been landlocked for perhaps many reasons. One of them has to do with the negligence, criminal negligence of the former Wayane regime, which for some inexplicable reason allowed the port of Asab to be absorbed into the secessionist Eritrean state. I have my own theories about that, mostly because I believe that regime did not really consider at heart the long-term interests, the historical interests, and the future destiny of the country, because a country that's landlocked, a country that does not have an outlet to the sea, is at a great disadvantage economically, politically, strategically, any number of additional ways. So the whole question of whether there's some justification for Ethiopia to have been landlocked is at best a misstatement of the reality, because Ethiopia has had access to the sea for at least over 1,000 years, since the Aksumite kingdom. The port of Adulis was there. Ethiopia used to be a regional power at the time, as history would testify. The Aksumite kingdom projected economic power, trade and commerce on the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea. So that begs the bigger question. Now, to me, the real question is not whether there's any justification, but how did Ethiopia lose its access to the sea, and what objective legal and historical circumstances undergird that loss? I don't think there is any, but we can talk about that.
How the issue dictates in the minds of Ethiopians being strategic or emotional in this regard?
Well, I mean, it is emotional. There is a visceral reaction to this great national tragedy, because a nation that has had access to the sea for over 1,000 years suddenly loses it 30 years ago. It's no longer there. People regard that as a great loss, as a personal loss, as a loss of dignity, as a loss of strategic capacity and access. And that by itself has a certain amount of traumatic effect on the psyche of the people, as it does, for instance, for me. And so the fact that it's emotional simply means that there is this kind of almost psychic attachment to what Ethiopia used to be historically, a great nation that was able to project power not only in the immediate area, but also in the Indian Ocean. And so for most people, I think, as they look at the historical trajectory going into the future, that is to say, Ethiopia's destiny. They see Ethiopia surrounded by a sea of Lilliputian states to tie down, as it were, the Ethiopian Gulliver. If I don't know if your audience is familiar with
the word,
yeah, with the book Gulliver's Travels and so on. So the idea is, it's, I think, instinctively objectionable to most Ethiopians that we should be chained down by a bunch of little states, failed states at that, and somehow they can dictate Ethiopia's destiny in the future. And that, I think, creates a sense of moral outrage, that somehow these little proto-states can dictate to Ethiopia what it cannot be. Ethiopia is a great nation, and it will be a great nation again, but through domestic turmoil and internal conflict and things of that sort, we have sort of self-wounded ourselves, and therefore whatever the Ethiopian giant may be, through self-inflicted wound has become basically incapable of not only asserting its strategic role and authority in the region, but also its own ability to govern its own polity. So I certainly feel that same degree of visceral reaction of loss, tragic loss.
Of course, a tragic loss and the traumatic effect that what you are saying. Yeah. Is it because of short-sightedness of those who are in a position to dictate and to maneuver everything at that time, or because of a self-inflicted tutelage which leads Ethiopia to be landlocked? From your perspective.
When the Wayane regime came into power, at the tail end of the Derg regime, they had this so-called negotiation and dialogue in London. And I recall distinctly Herman Cohen, the Assistant Secretary of State for the U.S., then and later on also in different interviews that he gave, actually insisted that Ethiopia retain control over the port in Assab. And as I understand it, at least as I recall, it was this Mallas Zenawi guy who declined the offer. And I think the logic of his argument was that somehow by refusing to take control over Assab and opting for an alternative sea outlet through Djibouti, he would be hurting the Eritrean regime or something along those lines. But the man was exceedingly short-sighted, and I think his primary concern was to seize power and to do whatever it is that he ended up doing. But he didn't have, in my view, the interest of Ethiopia at heart, and certainly I don't believe he truly believed in
the long-term national effects of Ethiopia.
Nor did he feel that he was the person to assert Ethiopia's sovereignty and dignity and unity and those kinds of things. I think his fundamental interest was antithetical to the very concept of Ethiopianness. I've written about this subject, on a number of occasions. I mean, anybody can get it at almeriam.com. I argued that it was a form of internal colonialism that he and his regime were conducting in Ethiopia. And therefore, as internal colonialists, and I know this might be controversial, but I don't care, that he gave away that port or access to the sea because somehow he didn't really deeply think through the whole idea of what sea access or outlet to the sea means for the long-term economic viability of Ethiopia.
Some people argue that beyond important export activities regarding sea outlet, Ethiopia's legitimate interest can be contravened because of the fact that short-sighted attitudes and the perceptions they have at that time. What sort of political and security implications can it have on Ethiopia being landlocked? other than importing and exporting goods and services, which is very trivial in this regard.
Well, think of a lion being caged.
Okay.
Ethiopia being the lion and sitting in a cage, and all these little people, as it were, coming out and looking at the lion in the cage. And then they're taunting the lion, and they're provoking it and doing all kinds of things and so on. I mean, that's sort of a rough metaphor for what we're looking here. We have these little countries surrounding Ethiopia, and they're dictating the terms of economic viability, as you suggested, in terms of how Ethiopia imports and exports its goods. Ethiopia's strategic role in the region. If you're in a cage, which is, you call it landlocked, I call it being caged, what could it really do? It is subject to the whims and fancies of these surrounding states, and they seek to determine Ethiopia's economic destiny in that specific sense. But beyond that, Ethiopia's ability to project its power throughout the region, throughout the Horn, and also over the Red Sea, to project, to assert some degree of sovereign authority in the littoral states and things of that. So all of that would be limited. And so we should not underestimate the fact that Ethiopia is landlocked, and that that state of being landlocked does not have serious implications. Apparently, that's what Meles Zenawi thought, that somehow by diverting the economic activities through Djibouti, through the import-export business and so on, somehow he would be ignoring or sidelining Eritrea, and therefore he forewent that possibility of having a natural outlet to the sea. But again, I mean, it begs the question whether or not there is any legitimate ground for Eritrea, for instance, to assert that kind of authority. On what basis did Eritrea get the legitimacy to control Assad, for instance? That is a matter to be...
Demographically speaking, Ethiopia is the second populous country in Africa. Economically, the third largest and vibrant economy. On the contrary, Ethiopia is also asking to access the sea, which is legitimate. But few actors, probably historical enemies, consider Ethiopia as belligerent, as a warmonger. And what is your take on that? Is that really the case, actually speaking?
Since the onset of Woyane regime back in '91 until about 7 years ago, the whole discussion about whether Ethiopia had a legitimate right or a historical right or any kind of right to access the sea, or even to exert some kind of legitimacy over Assad itself, was political taboo. There was political silencing. Nobody wanted to talk about it, and if you talked about it, you'd be
demonized.
You'd be isolated, ostracized, and all kinds of things would happen. And the reason, of course, that in itself tells you that Meles Zenawi and his...
The Zen regime, in short.
Yes. They knew the potential explosive nature of that question, and therefore anybody who would raise that issue would become...
very acceptable.
Well, be an enemy and so on. There has to be a narrative, and Ethiopia's historical enemies, particularly Egypt and Eritrea and so on, they have to demonize Ethiopia's claims and Ethiopian leaders and so on. And perhaps because we don't have a sufficient amount of intellectual firepower and informational firepower and so on to counter that, they've been able to depict Ethiopia, to paint Ethiopia as a belligerent nation. So somehow, by making an assertion for a sea outlet, Ethiopia is going to destabilize the region. Somehow the Horn of Africa will dissolve into some kind of internecine warfare where no one will be safe, and therefore Ethiopia becomes the principal suspect in the evolution of the region into chaos and war and conflict.
This is the narrative they put.
Yes, and yeah, because it's disinformation. That's what it is. Again, Egypt has its own self-interest in that. I mean, Egypt wants to remain the regional hegemon on the Red Sea, right down to the Horn, through the Indian Ocean and so on. Obviously, the Suez Canal is what they control. Now, you have in the southern end of the Red Sea another hegemon or potential hegemon. That's going to be somewhat problematic for them because it would be a direct challenge. It's also connected to the Nile riparian waters politics, the construction of the GERD. All of those things are tied together. But the idea is Egypt wants to maintain that hegemony, or at least what it considers to be historical and traditional hegemony. And then it's, as it were, its lapdog. Further south, they want to reinforce that, and therefore we have that problem. So if you ask me what the fundamental concern is, that Ethiopia, the trajectory that Ethiopia is taking in terms of its economic power, in terms of its prosperity and so on, is that Ethiopia is bound, inevitably, Ethiopia is going to be a power in the region. And I'm not just making that kind of assertion. The countries in the region, global powers and so on, are recognizing that because they see what has been achieved over the past 7 years and the way Ethiopia is going. They're going to cast their lot with Ethiopia than with Somalia or Eritrea and so on, or Djibouti or any of these self-destructive nations, as it were. Ethiopia is committed, is self-declared, has made it clear that whatever happens is going to happen peacefully through negotiation and dialogue and through mediation and arbitration, any means other than recourse to war and the use of force or arms. And this position that the Prime Minister has taken, it has support, I believe, in the foreign policies of the United States, the European Union, China. All countries that I'm aware of fully and absolutely support Ethiopia's quest for a sea outlet peacefully, which means that not just through the political and foreign policy support of these nations, but also under international law, the law of the sea being the principal mechanism. Now, the question is whether Eritrea is willing to negotiate this thing through international mediation or through bilateral relations and things of that sort. But there are different mechanisms where this issue can be resolved. I think the Prime Minister yesterday indicated clearly that perhaps 7 years ago, when he visited Assab, he and Mr. Afwerki had a conversation, and they had come to some sort of general understanding that things could work out peacefully and Ethiopia could have its
Ethiopia could have it, but eventually he has changed his mind, as we have it from the Prime Minister.
I suspect one of the fundamental characteristics of the man is that he's mercurial. He's one thing one day, something else. So he's not quite predictable and so forth. But regardless, Ethiopia's fundamental position, and so far has not changed, is that this thing, Ethiopia's access to the sea, can be achieved through peaceful dialogue and negotiations, perhaps through international mediation, through involvement of multilateral organizations, through economic ties, through perhaps even through the African Free Trade Agreement and so on. So there are various mechanisms. But again, the question is, what do you do if
we exhaust all possible remedies?
Yes, exactly. And once you exhaust all possible remedies, then you exhaust all other
last option.
Exactly.
Negotiation is the best option as per the Agenda 2063 of the African Union, or African solutions to African problems. Why do some countries tend to lobby their masters instead of discussing with their brothers in Africa regarding issues
the question,
like...
I've touched upon this in several of my previous writings. African solutions to African problems. And that's the question now. Whether or not Egypt considers itself African.
An African or not?
Yeah, that's a big question, $1 million question. But Egypt's position has been to go to Uncle Sam, that's the United States of America, and see if Uncle Sam can arm twist Ethiopia into submission. They tried that in 2020, and of course it didn't work for obvious reasons. Ethiopia is not going to bargain away its sovereignty simply because the United States is going to threaten to suspend foreign aid or something of that sort. And I think the United States clearly understood that that was not possible. I remember those discussions and the dialogue and the negotiations that took place at the time. So, I mean, there are mechanisms, African mechanisms, that and conventions and laws and other mechanisms that could facilitate this kind of resolution of these issues. But again, I mean, in terms of what can be done, I mean, the GERD is now a done deal. It's a fait accompli. It's done. Nothing you can do about it. Exactly. You can't reverse it. You can't undo it. You can't do anything of that. So does Egypt really have any other choice but to sit down and negotiate on the future utilization of Nile waters? Now, there is the CFA, the Comprehensive Framework of Agreement, to which I don't know how many, 7 or 8 African riparian countries, those are countries that are, have signed. Now that is international law, that's irreversible. You can't go back and reactivate or revive the colonial agreements of a century ago and so on, where Egypt could claim a birthright to the Nile, and also that somehow it is divinely ordained that Egypt can use the Nile by itself and for itself in perpetuity, forever and forever. Things have changed. Now the question to me is really very simple. The Egyptian leaders have created this narrative that not a single drop of water can be taken from the Nile and all that kind of nonsense. And now they're confronted with the reality that
eventually they surrendered.
Well, yes. And now they have to explain to their population why it is that Ethiopia has built this dam and now potentially can control the flow of the Nile. But a lot of it is of course, speculative, because once the water leaves the reservoir, goes into the turbine, it goes straight out. Yeah. It's a hydro dam, and it's a gravity dam, and it comes out and goes. Yeah. Now, the question is whether or not that rich silt that used to flow to Egypt would continue to do that. That remains to be seen. But again, there are laws that govern the riparian rights of those who use Nile waters or any riverine resources.
Okay. As far as legitimate interest is concerned, is there a lesson that can we draw between GERD and Ethiopia's legitimate quest to access to the sea?
Well, of course, both of them involve water.
Yeah.
And what Ethiopia has done is that it's used a river that has transboundary capacity and built a dam which takes into consideration the reasonable expectations and needs of downstream countries, consistent with the laws that apply to this kind of sharing of water. Here, we're talking about, instead of talking about the river, we're talking about the sea.
The sea,
and why Ethiopia would have a legitimate interest
to have access to the sea.
Yes, to the Nile, but not to the sea, is you know, not really truly a question. I think it's a red herring. But this needs to be examined and argued, and particularly the underlying law on that. The Prime Minister raised some very important issues about that. How did Eritrea get its control over Assab?
Absolute control.
Was there some kind of agreement? Was there some executive order? And from what he said, they searched every nook and cranny of government, and they couldn't find a single piece of paper that authorized the either Ethiopia's relinquishment or alleged relinquishment of its sovereign rights over Assab, or Eritrea's legitimate sovereignty over Assab. So if, at least for purpose of argument, Eritrea does not have that legitimacy established in law, then that opens a very different kind of situation, different kind of argument.
What sort of realistic and peaceful exit strategies are there for Ethiopia without triggering the region to get access to the sea?
And just sit down and talk. Mr. Afwerki, I don't think wants to talk because he's not the kind of guy who talks. I mean, look at the way he runs his country. There is no open discussion. There is no open expression or exchange of ideas and so on. You know, he dictates the terms of everything else, and he gets frustrated when he can't do that, and then he becomes essentially the bully of the neighborhood, as it were. Goes around and makes trouble. He supports little bandits and brigands, supplies weapons supplied to him possibly by Egypt and others, and that becomes essentially the destabilizing agent in the Horn, and that, of course, helps him deflect interest and criticism from what he's not been able to achieve in his country. And again, you look at the two countries and you say, well, what has happened over the past 7 years in Ethiopia and over the past 30 years in Asmara? I think the contrast would be rather stark.
A utopian view.
Yeah, so to get back to your question, yeah, sit down and talk about it. What does it take to make a deal?
Good.
What can we do in exchange to make this thing work? How can we bring our economies together so that Eritrea, which simply hasn't changed over the past 3 decades, could eventually achieve a certain amount of economic prosperity, and the people can benefit from what Ethiopia can offer. And I think those kinds of issues. But again, there has to be some fundamental interest in your own country, as well as being a good neighbor.
Wow, good neighbor.
Yes, and that's the problem.
Wow, amazing and fantastic, really. Distinguished scholar, political science and international relations senior researcher, human rights lawyer, Professor Almariam. Thank you so much for your perspective, really, I appreciate it.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Wow. Great. Now, ladies and gentlemen, by this we come to the end of today's show. Thanks for being with us. Until we meet with another edition of Addis Dialogue, you can follow us on different social media platforms of EBC. Goodbye for now.